I'm just going to start off by reading you something from this book. I'm a bit addicted to this book. P.L. Travers says, "Not long ago, a young woman whom I know slightly caught me up in the street and said breathlessly, 'Tell me something. How can I learn to be a woman?' I was surprised, for it seemed to me that the mere fact of having been born on the side of the yin was sufficient. A woman was what you inevitably and willingly became, as the seed becomes the flower. She had had, I knew, several lovers. Surely from these experiences, satisfying or otherwise, she could have learnt something that would have helped her to define her aim. I cast about in my mind for some instructive book, and my good angel tapped me on the shoulder. 'Read Grimm's fairy tales,' I said, and I left her open-mouthed and incredulous, standing on the corner." Couldn't resist telling you that. I have to warn you that I'm satiated with fairy stories after reading Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Tell me if I speak too loud, too fast, won't you? I'm absolutely filled up with them. I have also been absorbing The Nature of Loving by Vera Cast, as well as Individuation in Fairy Tales by Marie-Louise von France. Reading these books has raised a number of questions for me, which came about because a number of my patients were telling me about the book Women Who Run with the Wolves. How do contemporary Jungian analysts use fairy tales in their everyday work with patients? Can a fairy tale illuminate a patient's material without intruding upon the unfolding of their own individual story? Could talking about fairy tales rob a patient of her own precious homemade red shoes, replacing these with the shiny red shoes of clever theories? Or could it be possible for analyst and patient to reflect upon a fairy story in a way that could help them both to gain insight into a patient's internal world? Can you hear okay? In this talk, I'm going to look at two fairy tales as well as make a reference to the Vasilisa story. I will also use two lots of case material which come out of working with various patients who have been high achievers. I have decided to concentrate upon the female psyche and issues connected with some of the difficulties a woman can encounter in her path towards individuation. The characters represented in fairy tales are very close to the archetypes. They do not have a dialogue with themselves or suffer from doubts or conflict. The hero in a story, for instance, does not consider the consequences of his actions, but seems to be motivated by a need to explore new experiences in a blindly unconscious way. Characters in fairy tales represent one side of an individual's developing consciousness. Archetypal aspects of the psyche like beauty, innocence, purity, cleverness, courage, guile, ruthlessness, envy or evil battle it out in the story. You could say that the participants in a fairy story are not yet born into a whole state, and that each character in the story represents one aspect of an individual's developing state of consciousness. Well, let us plunge into the primal mud and look at the story of the red shoes. In the story, a poor motherless child had no shoes, but she was a very enterprising child. She collected bits of rag, and presently she had enough to stitch together her own red shoes. They protected her feet from the hardness of her life. She loved them with a depth of feeling that she had not experienced before. The homemade red shoes made her feel rich, despite the fact that she spent her days gathering food in the woods until after dark to sustain her existence. It was a hard life, but her creativity was still intact in a natural, untamed and feral state. One day, an old woman drove past in a gilded carriage. The carriage stopped, and the old woman told the poor girl that she would take her into her home and treat her as her own daughter. The old woman destroyed the girl's clothes and her much-loved home-made red shoes. She said that the girl's clothes were filthy and not suitable for the grand life she was going to live from now on. As you will know, it is dangerous for the psyche to be too clean. The child was very sad about the loss of her own red shoes, but found herself out of her need for love, drawn into conforming to the values of the old woman. She sat as if imprisoned in a gilded cage, still, good, clean, and speaking only when spoken to. But there was a secret fire burning in her heart. On the day of her confirmation, the old woman, who was by now very old and rather blind, took her to a shop to buy some new shoes. The girl's eye caught sight of a pair of shiny red shoes on a high shelf that were not at all suitable for church. In the story, these shoes gradually took possession of her and became stuck to her feet, driving her into a frenzied and manic dance which led to exhaustion and death. This brutal story demonstrates the cost to her psyche of the denial of her true nature in order to conform, and the way that her meaningful life had been robbed, controlled, and seduced from her. When she put on the new red shoes, all the pent-up feelings that had been locked away were released, and her psyche was flooded with all the uncontainable emotions that had been repressed at a terrible cost to her true nature. In this story, the unconscious played a trick by offering the considerable temptation of riches and an easy life, represented by the old woman and her gilded carriage, as a substitute for love. But the trap was that this easy life turned into an empty, gilded cage. We all know of women in this situation who may find themselves forced to abreact in a wild, manic way, where drugs and promiscuity can lead to the destruction of their femininity and even ultimately to death. Women who became locked into addictive behavior, from Judy Garland, an icon of Hollywood, and I can't help thinking of Lady Diana, come to mind. These women seem to have become victims of this loss of self. They have lost touch with their own precious handmade red shoes, which would have kept their feet firmly planted on the ground, and instead have succumbed to a state of insatiable, narcissistic, and addictive greed, which can never be satisfied. It seems to me valuable to be reminded of the pitfalls and traps that the psyche can set out for our patients as well as for ourselves on our perilous journey through life towards individuation. As a practicing analyst, I have found this recent immersion in fairy tales instructive as well as fascinating. I think that the fascination could become another trap set by this archetypal layer of the unconscious. One could get stuck in a gilded cage by identifying with an unconscious agenda that denies life. After all, Pinkola Este's book is, to my mind, overlong, and I understand is in danger of becoming a cult in the USA. Let us now have a look at some case material and see where it corresponds to the story of the red shoes. A patient of mine came into analysis feeling that her life was empty and without meaning. Her whole life was dominated by the absolute need to strive to meet the expectations of others. She came from a family where there had not been enough emotional warmth and containment, i.e. food, to go round. The emphasis was upon being good, which for my patient meant, unconsciously, to be perfect. She had a responsible and demanding job, but she hated working in a driven, chaotic environment where the workload was too heavy and where there were constant crises and breakdowns in communication. She was also dominated by a fantasy that it was her responsibility to hold the whole outfit together, setting herself impossible goals that she could never meet. This replicated the environmental failure of her childhood, where unconsciously she had felt compelled to hold her parents' marriage together. After work, she wrestled with a compulsion to stuff herself with large quantities of food, which left her feeling worthless and ill. It transpired that even at home she could never sit down, since there were endless, meaningless tasks to accomplish. Somehow her capacity to play had been lost in the mists of time, along with her ability to have a creative and loving relationship with the child within herself. You could say that she had lost her own homemade red shoes, which had been replaced by a set of standards and values that she could never live up to. Living life to a hidden agenda, where having to please another is at a violent cost to the true self, leaves an individual out of contact with their own internal treasure and their own unique sense of self-worth. As Pinkola Estes has said, to be ourselves may cause us to be exiled by others, and yet to comply with what others want causes us to be exiled from ourselves. I like that. A story comes to my mind from reading Individuation in Fairy Tales by Marie-Louise von Franz. She describes how, if an individual loses their soul or a part of it along their life journey, that part may be turned to stone. This seems to imply that a vital part of their psyche has become deeply repressed. In the Bach Bagheerd, a Persian fairy tale, the hero is sent on a dangerous journey by the weak king to find the treasure of the Bach Bagheerd. He has to accomplish many dangerous tasks along the way, some of which he achieves by means of repression. The dragon in the bottle trick, for instance, is a classic way to put off a problem by locking it away and diminishing its size. You know, you say to the dragon, I bet you can't get in there, and the dragon gets in there and you put the cork in. Of course, the dragon will turn up in another form later in the story, larger and even more angry, which is, of course, what happens with repression. When the hero finally enters the gardens of the mysterious Bach Bagheerd, where no one has ever returned, he finds many men turned to stone. So he knows what lies in store for him. His task is to enter the castle or bath where he discovers the terrible place of nothingness, which I think represents the fathomless nature of the self. He finds out that his task is to kill the talking parrot with a golden bow and arrow, which lies on a golden throne. This parrot is a beautiful and tricky creature with the human gift of speech, who is well versed in the verbal tricks needed to outwit a hero. At the first shot, the hero misses, and his legs are turned to stone. At the second shot, he also misses, and becomes stone up to his waist. And then he stops, and he thinks about the dilemma he's in, and he accepts his failure, which is to be human, and he puts his life into the hand of Allah. He shuts his eyes and he shoots the last arrow, which kills the parrot. This task seems to have demanded that he relinquish his ego control and trust to the terrifying and unknowable place of nothingness we call the self. A hard task indeed. In the story, after he has shot the parrot, all the statues come back to life, and the treasure of the Bark Baguette is revealed as a huge diamond, which our chastened hero takes back to the Queen. This results in a marriage between the Queen and the weak prince who originally sent our hero on this perilous journey. Thus, the male principle is strengthened, and there is a fresh union of the opposites. The marriage conjunctio is renewed and becomes strengthened. Now, where does this leave my patient? It would be possible to say that her femininity had been repressed and put on hold or turned to stone. Hence, she has found herself trapped in an androgynous and somewhat male world of thinking and obsessional control. Along with this has been a compulsion to be abusive towards her feminine nature, which has not had a look in and was constantly being stuffed with rubbish. She seemed to have been attempting to live out of the hero archetype when she first came into analysis, and had a lot of confusion about gender issues. She talked with rather a man's voice, you know. You could say that she had been bewitched by the parrot, whose hidden agenda had to be exposed and killed in order to reveal the true nature of the self within the patient. In this story, you will remember, the self is represented in the form of a diamond. But how does my patient create her own symbol of the self if there is such a seductive symbol, i.e. the diamond, provided for her by the story? It is important that analysts don't get seduced by the unconscious. I warned you, I've been reading a lot of these fairy tales lately, and so it's only too easy for me to be seduced by them. I can play this game as well. But is it a game? Why am I so fascinated? We have to remember the characters in fairy tales are very close to the archetypes. Perhaps this is why there are literally hundreds of versions of such tales, as for instance Cinderella. This story can even be traced to China, where the glass slipper takes on a sinister and abusive meaning for women. We can all think of our own tales that mean things to us, Beauty and the Beast, or the wonderful complex story of the handless maiden, which begin with the father endangering his daughter. When the internal father within the psyche fails to take account of issues of the soul, there is a danger that many things will not be as they seem upon first contact. This could mark a dramatic new possibility for a young girl, to release her from endless, meaningless chores, such as sweeping up leaves in the backyard. A chance to gaining consciousness, shrewdness, and ultimately wisdom. The gaining of consciousness is always painful and full of conflict. We are all tempted to take the easy route and to avoid the pain of enduring conflict, which is how we have to learn from experience. I remember being told as a child that I wouldn't be a proper rider of a horse until I'd fallen off 7 times. I thought it was very hard, and I found it hard to fall off, you see, so I wasn't a proper rider. Let us look at some more case material and try to gain some insight into how a patient's story had not been working well enough for her. A patient had a dream about a pair of wolves, male and female, who were walking along in the middle of a long straight road. There were other people around, making their own journey, but they seemed quite unconcerned by the presence of the wolves. These wolves seemed to be in very bad shape. Their coats were dull, and they looked exhausted, almost at the end of their endurance. My patient felt great compassion and love for them, and she wanted to help them. There was a large and very grand house on a hill behind the road, set in a large park, surrounded by a high fence. This was where her youngest sister lived. She wondered if these wolves needed to rest there in order to recover their strength. But this would mean that they would be in a compound like a zoo. She felt strongly that they needed to have a place to recover, to stop plodding on before resuming their search for their own wild territory. This patient came from a family where discipline had been enforced by severe beatings, by a father who dominated his family by fear. Over the years that she has been coming in analysis, she has very gradually gained access to more positive feelings of self-esteem and worth. She's much more able to sort out what is right for her and what is wrong. But she and I are aware that she can fall into the trap of landing herself with a punishing work schedule which replicates the old unconscious compulsion to try to live up to her internal father's expectations of her. So there is still a little girl, part of her, that clings to trying to be what she feels other people want her to be, so that they will not hate her. She remembers a song, "You are my sunshine, my happy sunshine." The older ones along will remember it. This is what this part of her still tries to be. So in a subtle way, she is still walking out on her own instinctual nature, represented at present by the wolves. Now, we investigate the transference. Is this going on in the analysis? We discover that she can't really believe that I care about her little girl because she's so envious of me and my big, rich, psychic house with all the good things in it. She also describes in a poignant way how she can get into terrible dark places out there. This is when her critical internal thugs come swooping in, telling her that she's useless and worthless. She wonders if there's a way of entering dark places in a creative way. She remembers there's a T.S. Eliot poem that describes entering dark places willingly in search of the creative process. The terrible place of nothingness, perhaps. We can't leave the wolves alone. And we find out, for several sessions, and find ourselves entering the wolves' world for a number of sessions, arriving at the eventual conclusion that the wolves need space to play in the analytic sessions. They need time to muck about together and to roll about in the dirt. So perhaps she and I could be a couple of wolves and confound the bad internal father by having fun together. In this sort of work, I like to talk about we, which I think represents for patients the nursing couple, mother and baby, enjoying mutuality. It can also represent an adult intercourse between an analyst and patient. A word called bushing, playing, emerges. To feel bushy, pleased, great mirth here. To be bushed, fed up. Bushed up, to hold your tail proud and high, to overcome destructive patterns of behaviour. It's worth remembering, silently here, that this is also a slang word for the vagina. This playing with the wolves seems to have a dimension of play and being in touch with instincts that may perhaps have been missing from our work. Perhaps it has been too much like all work and no play, as it was with father. In the next session, she told me about the way she had kept her tail bushy by saying no to a demand at work which would have invaded her own space. She felt delighted and energized by the recovery of this creative play space. It offered her, she felt, a new way of testing reality. Bushability, or to be enabled to be bushy, became the new buzzword of the moment in these sessions. There was a frisson of sexuality in the air. It was lovely. If you've come across a wonderful little book by P.L. Travers, What the Bee Knows, you will realize that you must remember to ask the wild bee what the druids knew. You must also tell the bees about important events of life and death, so that they can spread the word. After all, bees were associated with royalty. So talking to the wolves seems to be some sort of a variant on that ancient idea of talking to the bees. Then my patient said, quite off the cuff, "Do you know the story of Vasilisa?" I mean, I've been trying to find a way of introducing Vasilisa, you see. She had a doll in her pocket when she left the home of her wicked stepmother and the two cruel sisters. They sent her to find the flame in the forest. When she did not know what to do, or lost her way in the forest, she felt in her pocket and touched the wooden doll that her mother had given her on her deathbed. Her too-good mother, as you will know. The doll talked to her, telling her what she should do, and also protected her from danger when she was going off course. The doll seemed to be able to discriminate good and evil, right and wrong, love and hate, which just about sums up the work my patient and I have been doing over 7 years. Then she said, in a poignant way, "I have never had a doll in my pocket before. I really need those wolves." I live in a village outside Cambridge, and I was talking to a mother and her little boy about this and that as we stood by a red telephone box. A little dog on a lead found a place where a pane of glass was missing. He began to climb in and out of the telephone box, through the hole left by the broken pane of glass. The little boy looked up at me and with glowing eyes said, "When I was a little dog, I used to do that." And then we laughed with delight. We can still remember the wonder and delight of childhood when we can recover our capacity to time travel with Doctor Who. Patients come into analysis because they feel that a part of their psyche has been mislaid along the way. This can leave a hole in their life story which cuts them off from their own creativity and self-esteem, and which diminishes their sense of who they are. Every patient has his or her own unique story, which begins to unfold as the analysis develops. Bit by bit, the analyst and patient begin to negotiate the twists and turns of the patient's unconscious search for their own unique story that is leading them towards their own treasure. Unconscious memories begin to emerge. The story changes. Things begin to seem worse than either of us could have imagined. We get lost in a desert where we become irreconcilable enemies. The story is being enacted in the consulting room with all its original violence. It is as if the dragon has escaped from the bottle and grown into something huge and seemingly uncontainable. Repressed contents grow like a cancer, which is why they are so feared by our patients. In other words, the patient and I have been catapulted into violent opposition. The patient and analyst feel in despair, and they have no idea how or even whether this conflict can be resolved. The only way forward is to shut our eyes and trust to the unconscious, like the bath. A memory or a dream may come to life which at first feels unendurable for both of us. a child alone crying, desperate and mad with fear. This piece of the story, which is being recovered in its raw state, will carry with it powerful affect, which gradually over time becomes humanized and begins to fit into the pattern of this individual's life story. It no longer feels so dangerous and life-threatening because we have both survived the storm at a level where it had got stuck or repressed. It gradually becomes possible to realize that what has been reenacted in the analysis happened a long time ago. It is vital that a repressed content of the psyche is recovered at a pace that the patient can endure bit by bit. If it emerges too quickly, i.e. not at the patient's own natural pace, the red shoes could again get stuck to her feet. Mary Williams, an early member of the SAP, who knew a lot about the feminine psyche, said that she was apprehensive when there was not enough ego to pace the patient's descent into the unconscious. The most valuable discoveries are made by our patients, and I myself would be wary of introducing a ready-made story for them to latch onto. After all, when it comes to the crunch, the key, the arrow, or the wolf are a vital part of an individual's creation myth. What I want to emphasize is the uniqueness of an individual's psyche, which alone has the key. Patients are often propelled on a heroic journey in their urgent quest to find and locate their own lost treasure. This is a life-threatening journey, which is why it is important that a patient has a companion along the way. Sheila Pohl has pointed out to me that Clarissa Pinkola Estes could be criticized for her emphasis upon the creativity of immersing oneself in these stories, with the hope of identifying with a ready-made creation myth. Pinkola Estes claims that these stories can teach us how to reclaim and rejoice in our true feminine power. In Los Angeles, it is possible to go on Women Who Run with the Wolves workshops and seminars in the wilderness. The aim of these workshops seemed to be that women can acquaint themselves with the natural world via workshops using finger painting, drumming and singing to their vaginas. I'm indebted to Dr. Blandford for this information. Activating the unconscious in this way seems to ignore the danger an individual may find themselves in, for they may have landed on a roller coaster into the underworld, which may well continue for a long time. If this individual is not in analysis, he or she may once again find themselves alone and without a companion on their dangerous journey. This can often be a repetition of what has happened in their early life, and I'm concerned about the unconscious motives of people who go to workshops and may fall into this trap, whereby they're unconsciously looking for a quick do-it-yourself cure or perhaps a magic fix. If so, they may find themselves locked in the grip of the Ouroboros, the snake with the tail in its mouth, where the self can remain entombed. In a healthy upbringing, children can be in a position to shoot the parrot, make experiments in living with some degree of safety. The reality principle is held together in a good enough childhood environment by the parents. Later on in life, where an individual's psyche may demand urgent change, a qualified analyst who has made such a journey themselves in a lengthy training is, to my mind, necessary in order for this new possibility not to fail them a second time. The relinquishment of ego control is extremely perilous and is rightly felt to be a life-threatening time for the deintegrated psyche. It is a time when analysts carry a great deal for their patients. I hope that I have been able to share some of my thoughts over the place of fairy stories in Jungian analysis, and the way that they can be used within an analysis where transference and counter-transference are operating in a way that can lead to experiences of transformation within the safety of an analytic relationship. I find it fascinating that there are so many versions of these stories. Shakespeare was inspired by King Lear, a medieval tale closely related to the Cinderella cycle. Do you remember how love was described by Cordelia as mutton's need for salt? She was banished by the king because he thought she didn't love him. Wasn't good enough. In the medieval version, the king, now a beggar, is fed mutton without salt by Cordelia, who is now a princess, which of course is inedible and causes him to finally understand what she had meant. These ancient stories stretch from New Mexico, Brazil, Japan, Russia, Iraq, Armenia, and even, as I said, China. The point is that in our explorations of these wonderful stories, our inner eye may light upon a version of our own story that we can recognize. I think that this is the way to use fairy stories.